Welcome to Playful Beginnings, a podcast about the magic of play therapy for therapists, students, and anyone interested. In our podcast, we'll explore the deeper understanding of play therapy and the skills we use when working with children.
We hope to help you understand the why behind what we do and how it helps kids heal and grow. I'm Dr. Kristie Opiola, a working play therapist and university professor in North Carolina.
I'm Dr. Maggie Parker, a play therapist and professor in DC. Hey, Kristie.
Good morning, Maggie.
Oh, you said good morning instead of hey.
I know, I did.
Ooh, spicing it up.
New day, new reading.
I was thinking about you this morning and one of the conversations that we've had on the podcast about weather, because it's 34 degrees now. I was like, it was fall, spring.
Oh, yeah, we're cold. We're chillier too. And this weekend, I went and bought some plants. I'm a big gardener for people who don't know that. That's one of my self-care habits. And I have a big vegetable garden as well as plants. I love plants. And if I can grow things myself, I try to. So I got all my plants, but I knew I had looked at the weather. And here in North Carolina, the last freeze date is around the 15th of April. So we're always encouraged not to plant. So I knew we were getting another freeze tonight into tomorrow, or it's not even going to be a freeze. It's going to be like 36 degrees. But in North Carolina, that's freezing. So we were 90.
Yeah.
Friday, Saturday. I think we were 85 on Sunday. And so it's a big change to go from the 80s to back to the 30s. So my poor plants went in their greenhouse. So now they're protected until it warms up.
Yeah, I know. It was so nice for last weekend we were in Mississippi and it was hot, like hot and humid. And I was like, how did I live here? Because it was so sweaty. I was like, what is happening? I gauge it all by baseball, right? And I was like, oh man, I hope we won't have any of those freezing cold rain baseball games. And now we're there.
Rain, baseball games.
Baseball games. Rhodes House went from 7 till 10 on Thursday night. Third grade.
Oh, just like, what happened to being thoughtful of like what children need? Like, why are they playing till 10 p.m.?
They're on a school night, no less.
I know. How is he supposed to function on Friday?
I
At
don't
least
know.
the spring break, I believe, next week.
Yeah, next week's spring break. So we're going in, we leave Friday to go to Colorado. Yeah. Molly, my daughter does not like traveling. She doesn't like planes. And so we had to make a last minute flight to Mississippi. One of our very good friends, Susie Poole, passed away. So we went to go celebrate her life with her family, which meant that we had to get a 6 a.m. flight out of DC. So we had to wake up at 4 to then fly to Houston, to then fly to Mississippi, to get in the car to drive to Meridian. And then we left. So we got there Thursday night and we left Saturday afternoon. And Molly goes, you mean there's only one day when we're not on a plane? One day? Oh, sweet girl. Yeah. And then we're going to get on another one.
I know, but you'll have more time on this next trip.
Yes.
Away.
More time to relax and play with grandparents. So very exciting. So some things that have come up that I thought we could maybe talk about, and I talk a lot about this with students and supervisees. And it's also an area that I need to be pretty upfront about, that I'm a little bit more insecure about. I'm not as confident, and that's diagnosis. I don't love diagnosing kids. I'm pretty...
Right. It can be really helpful, and it can be something that follows them and has limitations. And, people see kids a certain way with a certain diagnosis. So I agree. I also am cautious. I really lean into theory here around diagnosis, right? Like, what does that mean? What is the purpose of it? We live in an era where managed care requires it, but it really doesn't change my view or what I think the child's going through. And theoretically, that feels like that aligns with Rogers, looking at it with unconditional positive regard. And when we put a diagnosis, it's really about judgment.
Mm-hmm.
I also talk a lot about the DSM is really a way to categorize behaviors.
Hmm.
And that's really it's a lot of behavioral symptomology. That's the only thing they're looking at, which is pretty limiting. But
Right.
yeah.
One of the things I really struggled with when I was working in intensive outpatient and the juvenile detention center was the amount of children that were diagnosed with really intense diagnoses of conduct disorder and oppositional defiant. And it was really around this time that I leaned into trauma, like childhood trauma, because one of the clients or the people that I had seen, well, all of them had pretty significant childhood trauma, whether it be physical or sexual abuse or neglect. And the diagnosis was oppositional defiant. And it was just really confusing to me, right? Because these were behaviors, yes, that perhaps aligned with that diagnosis, but the cause, the root of what that was happening was significant trauma. And like, how do we heal from that trauma? And would that alleviate some of the symptoms?
Well, and I think that's something that sometimes diagnosis, when we're diagnosing, gets missed is what is really at the root of what's happening here. Because I see the same thing. I don't always get conduct disorder, but I often have kids with a ton of diagnoses,
Mm-hmm.
have early complex traumas. And it's often a red flag for me that, like, oh, we haven't looked at the root. We're just looking at it through symptoms and not really like figuring out. The other thing that's hard for me is behaviors to me are a way for kids to communicate their needs. And so when I look at diagnosing using the DSM, yes, it helps with reimbursement, it helps with health insurance, or it doesn't help parents and other individuals understand what the underlying need is. It just
Mm-hmm.
helps identify behavior. So that's really the difficult part for me. The other thing is the DSM is really not for kids. Right. It was created to describe adult behaviors. And yes, there are some kids sections and some kids diagnosis in there, but they're few and far between when we look at the big manual of the DSM. And
Mm-hmm.
so diagnosis, I'm on the same boat. It's a hard part for me. I do it, it's required, it's part of our professional practices. And I have long conversations with families about like what this means. Will this offer this kid more services? That's
Right.
typically what I'm looking at. And I often can pinpoint it to something that's going on in the family system or in the child's history. And so I don't know, it just feels like a required sticky situation.
Yeah, it is a required sticky situation. And I think it's hard too, because usually they are expecting a diagnosis pretty quick. And sometimes
First session. And I'm
first
like,
session
met your kiddo yet? Because really, my first session is the
intake.
intake with the parent.
Yeah. So you're kind of going off of like, we're doing what we're supposed to do,
Mhm.
right? So we're listening to the parents and the symptomology, their developmental history, what's happening in multiple spaces, and then trying to concisely put that information into the least restrictive diagnosis.
Right. And not underscored and not,
Right.
it is hard. It feels like I'm guessing a little bit in the initial intake with some good information. It's not a total guess, right? Like I do have information, but it's always interesting because when I meet the kid sometimes presents totally different than the way parents or teachers are like defining the child.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I feel like in a juxtaposition, right? Like, because I have this one side that's like sharing all this information and I 100% trust parents' perspective and teachers' perspective. And then you meet the child and you get a totally different person. And sometimes, until they know you, they really don't show their true selves
Right.
either. So I'm like, okay. And then sometimes I never see it. And so I'm like, what is so different about being in here that this kid doesn't show these behaviors? And that sometimes means I have to go make observations in other beings and conversations and interdisciplinary, like working kind of meetings to figure out like why is it so different here? What's going on?
Mm-hmm. It's really like trying to gather as much information to make as an informed decision as possible. And I do think we are qualified, right? We have the capacity. And I think we're very careful as to how to use that responsibility. And that's I think, the really important part. And sometimes the diagnosis shifts as we get to know kids. Sometimes they're going to be different. So a lot of times in the spaces that I was working at, it was a diagnosis from another professional, whether it be a medical doctor or a psychiatrist. And so I would kind of, when I would type up my notes or the treatment plan, I would say diagnosis per this person. Because I really want it to be known that this is important information and this is who identified this. Because sometimes my diagnosis would be different.
And I share that a lot with my students and supervisees around, once you put it in your diagnosis, you are confirming that diagnosis. So if someone else gave them a diagnosis that you may or may not, I mean, in particular, if you don't agree with, right, it's more helpful to put who diagnosed them.
Right.
That doesn't convey you necessarily agree with it. You're just acknowledging, right, that in different settings, this kid might show up differently. Um, but I don't, I encourage them not to put that that's just the diagnosis and not, I always use this term, don't swallow it whole, right? Like you should rule it out to make sure that that's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Because once your name goes on it, you're confirming it.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's not what you confirm, I also think this is a good time for us to talk about collaboration and really communication with psychiatrists, with school
Mm-hmm.
504 IEDP or IEP teams, right? To really kind of have opportunities to have conversations of what you see compared to what they see, so that when they are prescribing medication or their nurse practitioner or their pediatrician, right? To how can you be in communication with them to have conversations about what is being seen?
Right. I think it's really helpful. I've gone to, clients' IEP meetings, and usually it's, or 504s, and usually it's to say, like, these are the things that I do in the playroom that might be helpful,
Yeah.
that you can put into the 504 plan, like reflect, limit setting or choice giving, returning a responsibility, reflecting their feelings, even like having a break. Sometimes kids have a lot of energy. And so it comes out, it can be disruptive in the classroom. And it's like, okay, so if they're dysregulated, what can we do that supports you, the teacher, the other students, and this child? It's like, do they have someone that they can go walk around the gym with and get some of that anxious energy out? Is there, I think a lot of the classrooms in the elementary schools here have like calm down corners. Like, can they go to the calm down corner? What does that look like? Can they take a break? One of the preschool teachers that I really appreciate, I keep calling him Dr. Drost, Mr. Drost. He's so spectacular and talks a lot about feelings and how to engage and understand our feelings and what our feelings share with us. But if someone's overwhelmed, they can also just go under their desk and draw for a little bit. And sometimes it's just, yeah, I think it's really important to get their perspectives. And it's so nice when there are breaks for kids that need them.
Well, and I also think it's always one of the things that I'm seeing in schools when I've gone into 504s is how we are really not matching development
Yeah.
in school systems, especially in the elementary grades. Like we are really trying to rush development. And so we're asking kids to do things that are really out of sync with developmental behaviors and
Mm-hmm.
development as a whole. And so that can be really challenging and kind of helping teachers understand that component, as well as, helping them understand maybe the underlying needs that the child has. And this is where you have to be really careful, right? Because of HIPAA and confidentiality, I have really long conversations with parents before I ever meet with schools or someone else, like what can be talked about, what can't be talked about. I might possess information that I think could be helpful, but I don't want to disclose things you haven't shared with the school or you choose for the school not to know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do try to maneuver that line carefully,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if a school doesn't want, or if a parent doesn't want the school to know about part of this kid's history, yet part of this kid's history is really playing out in the day-to-day school environment, I think that can be really, a minefield to navigate at times because you're like, oh gosh, how do I share this without disclosing parts for this family? And sometimes that's going back to the family to say, you know what, I think it would be really helpful for the school to have a little bit more information. I understand why you're wanting to be protective, right? But I think it's limiting the ability for them to provide certain services. Um, and when suggested, they seemed hesitant or, viewed it more as defiance, manipulation, and it can be something so minor. This kid needs water when requested because their history shows them that they don't get their basic needs met. And that can be a really big trigger in the school. And so you put them in the back of the line because they were cutting in line, right? And that is a rule, but then that means they get water last, which then is triggering. And then we see this uptick in behavior. Do you know what I mean? Like it can be around, like we just go round and round. And if they don't understand where that behavior is coming from, why water is so important to this kid and getting that need met, you're climbing up a big hill sometimes. But
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. I think about that a lot. And one of the stories you've shared about doing child teacher relationship training and therapy, and how, a student was really having a hard time. And then you suggested, well, what if you went in a different order and they were called first as opposed to called last? And it changed everything, right? And so I think it also goes back to how, kids are really wonderful observers and terrible interpreters, because it was like, oh, I'm not important, I'm not valued. And I think about that a lot when with kids, not necessarily in the playroom, because I think I'm cognizant of it in the playroom, but even just on the playground, or when I take my kids to the park, and or I'm doing bedtime, and what messages might they be interpreting from me in this space? How can I be more cognizant and purposeful?
Mhm. Yeah, and that like goes back for me theoretically, right? Like what are the internal message this kid tells about themselves and how might I inadvertently reinforce that message,
Right.
right? And yeah, for that kid in particular, it's hard. You have an idea and you want to share, but then every other kid gets to share before you. So you're having to constantly think of new things to share because your friends keep sharing your ideas without ever getting to share your idea first. That's really the conversation the teacher and I had. And this teacher was like, "Oh, I didn't even think of it from that perspective. It just felt orderly to me, right? Like the rationale made sense.
Yeah.
And right this kid is always the one getting in trouble and he's always last. How do we help him? Is there something minor we can do to switch that so he doesn't always feel like the caboose within this dynamic? Yeah, it's really, I was just sharing that story to someone yesterday about like school dynamics and how kids can be terrible interpreters, but so can adults.
Yeah.
Not outside of that realm either. And sometimes it's helpful to have an outside observer see it. And really, that's how I was able to see it. I don't think I'm better or have, this magical wisdom. It's just watching it and being like, oh, I think this is what's playing out here. Let me just share what I was seeing and see if that resonates with this teacher. Uh,
Hmm.
but yeah.
Yeah. It's really being attuned. And I think, if we go back to kind of diagnosis, we're being very attuned to like what the parents are telling us. And then we're really attuning to what the child is experiencing and playing out in that space, and really trying to kind of understand and explore from that perspective. And someone was telling me a while back, um, about an adjustment disorder. And so it was adjustment disorder with anxiety. And this person is also a psychologist. And so they were like, how can you have, an adjustment disorder is like 3 months, and how can you keep having this diagnosis? And the therapist said, well, if you think about it from a child's perspective, there's constantly new things that are happening in their lives that they're adjusting to, and their development is so rapid.
Well, so they're having now to adjust from a different developmental standpoint, right? So not only is the world adjusting, but they keep adjusting too. And so, and we expect kids to do that
Very
quickly and
quickly.
not have any problems with it. Where, like we get to our ages and our developmental stance is moving more in like 5 year increment, like where we're making
Mhm.
a big shift every 5, 10 years, where kids are making it sometimes every 3 months, every 6 months.
Right. Well, and even just the idea of if we had a new boss every 9 months,
Hmm.
that would be really hard to get to understand their perspective and their style and the way they interact and what they're looking for. And that's what kids do. It's like, and my daughter, bless her heart, like had a teacher, and the teacher had a baby in the middle of the year. And so then she got a new teacher. And then she'll get used to this teacher, and then it's summer.
Or the teacher comes back from maternity leave.
Right. And this is not to say like people
Teacher.
should not go on maternity leave. Absolutely, they should. I think it's also just recognizing that that will be hard for kids.
And how well do we transition them and prep them, and where our state of education is right now? Like long-term subs are not predictable. And so, and teaching is not predictable, just teachers are tired, and teachers, like many of us, can only handle so much.
Yeah.
So it is hard. But to be mindful of that too,
Hmm.
and not to lean solely on adjustment disorder. I think that is
Yeah.
something we sometimes can experience has been. It's like a safe diagnosis,
Hmm. It does feel safe.
and I can justify it pretty quickly.
Hmm.
But I also need to make sure I, do a good differential diagnosis, that I'm not just leaning somewhere I know and there's not something else happening.
Yeah.
The other thing that I am becoming more and more aware of is how many of the diagnoses are gendered too, right? And so the symptoms that are in the DSM are really based on studies that look at certain populations. And does that really match either culturally, gender? Those are probably the two big ones that stick
Hmm.
out for me.
Yeah.
Uh, how well are these versed, and do we take those components into consideration? So a good example of that is ADHD, right? ADHD for women shows up very differently than ADHD for men. That is true for girls and boys too. And girls often get different diagnoses over ADHD, but ADHD might be the underlying diagnosis. But we don't talk about that a lot.
Yeah.
I really appreciate people who are bringing that to the forefront
Yeah.
for us to have conversations, because if I'm just looking at the symptomology, that was really based off of a strong male population. It's the same thing about medical diagnoses like heart disease or heart attacks, right? Like women show different early signs, warning signs of a heart attack than men do, but we're often not asked the early female warning signs. We're asked the male warning signs. And
Right.
so I think we have to be thoughtful of that in the DSM as well. And when we're
Hmm.
diagnosing, as well as cultural components, like, well, how is this viewed in this culture? And like, what is the expectation? And how might symptoms show up slightly different based off of cultural factors? That's a strong requirement for us to be thoughtful about as we are diagnosing both for adults and kids.
Hmm. Absolutely. I think it's so important, and it's dynamic. It's and
Yeah.
it evolves and it shifts and you understand more, and that's it could be painted as like, well, you were wrong the first time. I think it's also really recognizing like I learned more, and so I adjusted based upon my increased understanding, and that's important.
Yeah. I was just
Um,
and there's a scholar, I believe he's out of UCLA, who also talks about, in particular, about like diagnosing and discipline within school systems for children of color,
yeah.
compared to and how we view behaviors of children of color differently than we view behaviors of maybe white children in our classrooms. His last name is Howard. I was just looking at I think it's Tyrone Howard. Um,
Is it Lionel Howard? He does a lot of this work too.
no, I believe it's Dr. Tyrone Howard, but how it can be really hurtful. The prison to pipeline phenomenon that happens in our education system, but also we do know that more children of color, minoritized children, have more special education diagnosis, some other things. And is that really true, or is it really incumbent upon us to be really good stewards? And diagnosis is one of those things I think we need to be a really good steward of as we are looking at diagnosing, because this does follow kids, this does have implications for kids, this does skew the lens of how other people look at children along the way.
Yeah. And this was something, so I am like technically the school counseling faculty, right? So like while I took play therapy classes in school, I focused on school counseling. And one of the studies that I did was a qualitative exploration of teachers and how they determine referral services, right? Or how do they make referrals? And it really kind of, I think we interviewed 20 teachers of like varying grades and levels and locales. And a lot of it was if it's externalizing, so if it's like kind of more disruptive, then it got sent to discipline. Like
Mm.
those are our discipline referrals. If they were more internalizing, if they looked sad, then they were referred to the school counselor. And then when their learning was disorganized, they were sent to special education services. And all of those symptoms can be symptoms of trauma. They could be symptoms of anxiety, like all of them can. And so it's like you have to kind of look again at the whole picture. You can't just look at least I try not to look at just symptoms.
Yeah.
And another thing that I get that I'm interested in your perspective is I'll have, supervisees and students say, well, and I see it on like play therapy spaces of, well, this person has this diagnosis. What do I do different?
Uh,
And I'm curious your perspective on that. I know mine. I think we're probably,
Probably pretty aligned.
yeah.
I don't do anything different.
No. I mean, I don't think that's entirely true, right? I think that it helps inform how we reflect,
Yeah.
but the way we are in the room, the skills that we continue to use, our way of being does not shift.
No, I think it just informs us of maybe choices of ways we want to respond sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
When I know I have a client who has a lot of like dysregulated behavior, it's about providing a lot of predictability and stability in the space so they, can show up more authentically than having often to be really reactionary to the environment. So that might look different based on, what that looks like. That might be a lot of empathic responding. That might be more limit setting. That might be more, choice giving so that they feel like they have a sense of control in the environment. So as I'm getting to know the client, it also helps me know how to respond. Because I think deep down, I really believe behaviors are just ways of communicating. And so they're communicating something is off. They're not getting something they need. And so what way can I provide an environment that can provide what they need? And then when I figure that out, how do I share that with their systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
Layered systems so that they can also know what kids need and how to respond to the needs that kids have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it helps me attune, right? And so I'm like, okay, so am I looking for this? But it can't close off your understand like that holistic perspective. Like it's a piece that I'm taking into consideration, but then I also have to consider the child that's in front of me and what is going on for them.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that. And I can't remember who said this to me, right? Like all of the stuff we do in the playroom is really our best hypothesis of what is happening. And as, maybe my hypothesis gets confirmed or um, corrected, right? I need to shift and adjust with that. But I can't always bring in the same glasses to see the hypothesis with because I can get really tunnel vision I can quantify anything to answer this one question. I was actually doing supervision yesterday with a student, and the student was like sharing the narrative that they have about this student, and then we watched part of the video, and in my head, I'm like, that narrative is not, I think we're missing a piece of the narrative here, right? Like something, the hypothesis is off in some way. And so we were just talking about it because we can look at things very clearly from like a trauma lens and like justify anything from trauma and then go back and the behavior doesn't support trauma. And that's what we were seeing for this kiddo yesterday. And that's kind of what I was bringing to the students' attention is that I'm like, I don't know that, and maybe I'm looking at too simplified, but let's just converse about this, right? Like this kid is not, there's no hypervigilance, there's no, and if the way you're speaking about the trauma of this client, I would expect to see more hypervigilance. And that's not what's happening. They're able to stay really focused. They are responsive to what's happening in the environment, but they're not reacting to the environment. There's nothing's getting triggered here. And then another time it looks like it gets triggered and they respond. And so we were just spitfiring what else could be going on here. So, that is our lens too closely tunneled a certain way that we aren't willing to look holistically at what's happening, which is what you were saying.
Yeah.
That's a very verbose way of saying what you said in a very simple statement.
No, I appreciate it because I mean, anytime we talk, I just learn a lot from you. And so then and because this is how my brain works, right? I'm like, am I doing this right? And so I kind of think back of how do I do this in this space and what am I aware of and how do I open up my perspectives and try and align with both what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing and yeah.
And I think acknowledge, because I'm in the same boat, I second guess myself all the time. And acknowledging the lens that I see the world through, right? Like, so acknowledging that trauma is a big part of
Right.
sometimes that first screening I'm doing with clients, that and attachment are the two strongest for me,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I can justify almost anything through those two lenses and can be totally wrong.
Yeah.
And so, really needing, we say this every time we meet, right? Like having those people you can talk things through with so people can say, that's not making sense. Like, have you thought this side of it? Or have you relooked at it differently? Or if I threw this caveat, would that change the way you viewed something about this client? And it's like, oh yeah, it certainly would.
Yeah.
And so just staying wide open. And I love the statement that Gary Landris says in his book, and I've heard him say lots of times, and really has stood out to me across, my time as a play therapist and as a teacher is we meet kids with expectancy, not expectations. Right. And I think that's what we're kind of talking about here is expectations is we're expecting this to happen because this is how we're viewing it. And so when a child does it, it confirms our expectation. But when we go in wide open with, I don't know where this kid is going to take me today. And I'm really interested in the journey and I'm open for wherever we go. And I'm going to look at it with a really wide open lens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's that. And that aligns also with our theory and how we understand and conceptualize. And
If I'm going to be honest in like my trajectory, I was kind of anti-diagnosis, anti-medication. Like I think play therapy can heal everything early in my career.
yeah.
And I do want to say that I don't, as a child-centered play therapist, I am not anti-diagnosis. I, what I'm anti is that diagnosis defines that client or that child, right? That I think children are much bigger than their diagnoses. It's one piece of something. And sometimes kids do need medication to get over the hump so that we can work on coping strategies. We can work on these things, or they can get the tools, right, to be more successful. And so I just share that because I don't think I'm alone in that when I started my journey or even, down the line and being experienced, it can be a both and it doesn't have to be an and or an or it doesn't have to be an or, it can
Or
be
it
an,
can be an and.
yeah.
I wholeheartedly agree. I think it was really easy at the beginning to be like, nope.
And
And
that's not true. The book said no diagnosing. Carl Rogers said this is terrible.
but it does. And I think this conversation that we had last week about books and your child who wanted how that diagnosis helped them understand themselves. And it is so important. And I've seen medication really help a child be able to then work in
Mhm.
that space. And so I don't always want it to be a front line, and I don't want it to be kind of like the magic pill, if you will. And I also have to recognize that also, like as a human being, as a person, I want the magic pill, right? Like I want that for myself. So it makes complete sense.
You don't want to be suffering. You want to feel capable and accepted and all these things. So yeah, it can feel like a magic pill.
Mhm. So yeah, I think it's important to recognize that it's important to do all of these things, and it doesn't have to be as strict and as anti or my way or the highway. I think that the more you get into this field, the more you realize like we're all doing things to help support kids. And
Yeah.
when we work together, that's really helpful. We can't just exclude things.
Well, and I think all those different viewpoints and lenses are really important. And if all the partners can come to the table with open minds and share, right, and be open to hearing, then we can really shift and support kids in the ways that will best support them. And that includes us, right? Like not
Yeah.
being the things. And I do sometimes find it hard as the person who has the most contact with this kid, on these teams. Sometimes I'm like, okay, I hear that. And, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
I've met with this kid for 42 sessions every week for the last 42 weeks, and I haven't seen any of that.
Yeah.
Right. Or the only thing we've seen change is the environment that this kid is in. Like they have a new boss in their classroom, right? A new teacher. And then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, 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 where is this coming from? You know,
Yeah. No, I think it's really
not
like
their
we have
first
to
boss,
be
it's like their fifth boss, and you're still like, what? Can we go back to what about this school year is so different
right.
compared to last school year, right? And what is making this big shift, or what is causing an escalation in anxiety and escalation in depression, hyperactivity, right? Like reactivity, whatever it is. Let's kind of
Figure
explore
that out.
what is shifting that is causing that change.
Yeah. No, I think that's helpful.
Development, it could be the teacher, it could be the pressure that shifts as they get older, and
Yeah.
other things become more important, like the product of what you produce is really important in many schools, and how that impacts kids,
Yeah.
you know. So
Well, thanks, Kristie. I appreciate this.
thanks, Maggie. I always love our time together.
I love it. So listen, subscribe.
I was gonna say, if you have questions, right up here, you'll see Play
Play
Therapy
therapy space.
on is our website, but you can email us at info@playtherapyspace.com.
Yep.
We'd love to hear your voice, what you want us to talk about. If you have a story you want to share, feel
Yeah.
free. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.